This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm here today in an internet situation with none other than writer Ben Aldes Wurgaft. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well, Jamie. Thank you so much for calling and for taking the time to chat a bit.
Well, we are here to talk about your wonderful book, Meat Planet, Artificial Flesh and the Future of Food. It's a plug if ever there was one. Now, how did you come about to be writing a book about cultured meat?
So, by training, I'm a European intellectual historian. I just happen to have the odd fortune to come from a family that's been professionally preoccupied with both food and history and food studies for a long time. And I worked in restaurants in my late teens and early 20s. And then when I went to graduate school, which I did at the University of California, Berkeley, I worked as a food writer. So I started to publish different kinds of reportage and essays and criticism in my early 20s, and have been doing it for about 20 years now as a result. And I had written articles and books about the history of philosophy, which is really my academic preoccupation for the most part. And then around 2011, 2012, when I was in the first of the postdoctoral fellowships that I would do, I became aware of this topic that seemed to bind together all my interests and possibly give me the opportunity to interest a broad readership that was excited about food in some philosophical questions. So the idea of growing meat in a lab raises questions that are moral as well as almost ontological, having to do with the nature of animals, including ourselves, both because it raises questions about the animal species that we eat, and also because it raises questions about what the cells that we're made of and that our food animals are made of really are. So I was thrilled by the idea of a topic that would let me finally work in both of my areas of passion at once. And I lucked into a grant from the American National Science Foundation, which allowed me to do a second postdoctoral fellowship. My first one had been at the New School for Social Research in New York. My second one was at MIT in Cambridge, my hometown. And I worked with an anthropologist of science named Stefan Helmreich, whose work had been a big influence on me. So I did about 5 years of field work, and there it is.
So for those people new to the whole concept of cultured meat, how does one produce cultured meat?
Yeah, now actually, this is a wonderful point for the sake of our audience to back up a little bit and say, to be very clear about the fact that laboratory grown meat, also known as cultured meat, sometimes called clean meat or cultivated meat, does not exist as a consumer product as of this conversation. Whether or not it will is very much up for grabs. It's uncertain. So in short form, one doesn't produce cultured meat in the same way that one produces masking tape or threaded screws or any number of other consumer products. There's no local brewery scaled business producing sort of vat grown meat in your neighborhood. There are these products causing a bit of confusion for me right now. There are these products based on plant cells, which your audience is probably intimately familiar with: the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Meat Burger,
Yes.
a number of other plant-based meat alternatives. And the best way to trace the difference between the two is that we have a considerable history of decades of plant-based burgers and sausages and other meat replacement products that are based on the idea of sensory equivalency. And sensory equivalency means replicating the mouthfeel and the taste, cooking characteristics of, for example, a beef patty. It's mimicry. And the lab-grown meat people, by contrast, the scientists and entrepreneurs trying to create lab-grown meat, want to proceed not from the taste, but from the cell. Their view is that we can end up with a better copy, what they call more mimetic product, if they begin by taking a biopsy of satellite muscle stem cells from a cow, a pig, a chicken, putting them in an in vitro situation and causing them to multiply, feeding them with the form of growth media. And they believe that they can do this and end up with meat. They would also need to culture fat cells. They might need to stimulate those cells mechanically or electrically. There are lots of complicated technical procedures that I'm not touching on at the moment, but in essence, to produce laboratory-grown meat, you need animal cells, you need a bioreactor, probably some form of growth media, and you need apparatus and staff trained to do the work.
So it's incredibly costly at the present moment in time to create one burger.
Yeah, and actually, you know, as you say, it's quite costly, and that cost is often cited by critics who want to say, well, this will never happen. This will never, to use the word as a verb, well, this will never scale. It's my view that that's a little unfair from the standpoint of the development of emerging technologies, because the first computers were behemoths in university basements that cost spectacular amounts of money, far more than the much more powerful devices that we're now using to conduct this interview.
Right.
There are other reasons to ask questions about the scalability of lab-grown meat, but the initial cost of doing it, I think, isn't one of them. And I'm not, I should say, that we talk about it, I'm not an advocate for the technology or a critic of it. I do my best to be a kind of a commentator.
One of the chapters I found most interesting was at the beginning of the book, where you break down the etymology of the word meat itself. Would you mind speaking a little to that topic?
Oh, of course. I think that the question of the definition of meat is on everybody's minds. The people who want to protect what they think of as conventional beef production, typically people who are part of the beef or pork industry, for example, here in the States, are eager for definitions that would make it harder to present laboratory-grown meat or plant-based meat as meat. So they're eager for narrow definitions. And there are also people, usually proponents of laboratory-grown meat, who are very eager for wavy definitions, because their goal is for as many of us as possible to replace the in vivo meat we consume with in vitro or plant-based alternatives. Most of the people who promote this technology the hardest are animal protection activists at heart. Some of them are environmentally motivated, but the two biggest motivators are animal protection and environment. But the reason I wanted to meditate on the actual history of the word meat in Meat Planet is because it so obviously bears on these debates. In truth, like most words, meat has a history of rather shifting usage. I use somewhat academic language, and I call it an unstable signifier, or a signifier that's always empty but always appears full, because if you or I say meat, we're going out for meat. we're getting to the meat of the matter in this interview, we mean something basic, something whose significance is obvious, something that obviously is what it seems to be. And my point is that actually meat's history is one of non-obviousness, that meat in the Middle Ages in the British Isles, what are now the British Isles, meant solid food as opposed to drink.
Yeah.
And that whether or not we would include the offal in our definition of meat, offal deriving from abfall, literally that which falls away in the process of butchering an animal. This is all something that shifts and changes, and it particularly changes with the advent of modern industrial animal agriculture, which enabled us to eat more meat more regularly in greater numbers than previous human populations more or less have, and enabled the phenomena that I refer to in the book as cheap meat. So if we live in a world of cheap meat now, much as we live in a world of cheap or fast fashion, we live in a world in which everything that's undesirable about the production of certain things that make life better or more pleasant for many, everything that's bad has been sort of outsourced or turned into an externality of a process. And one of the arguments in Meat Planet is that we might want to look more carefully at those seeming externalities.